everybody. Welcome to the BWC Online Bible Study. Today we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 21. We've been on this journey with Abraham and Sarah as we're reading through the Bible, a chapter at a time in the book of Genesis right now. And Abraham and Sarah were given a promise by God. And it was a really long time before that promise came to pass, 25 years. If you think about that, sometimes we're praying for stuff and, a week will go by and we feel like the Lord has abandoned us and he doesn't care and he's not going to answer our prayer. Or do what he said, because here it's not even really like they're just requesting something from God. God himself had promised something to them. And as they are walking on this journey, we see the building of their faith as they go. Abraham trusted God enough to get up and leave from where he was and go where God was telling him to go. And as he's walking on this journey of faith, there are some times where he faltered and where he made decisions that God had to kind of fix as he went along. And we see the grace and the mercy of God. But the fact that Abraham's heart was pointed toward God, the fact that he loved God and that he, desired to be obedient to him, God sees the heart of a person. And that is why God was able to use Abraham to bring forth this child that we're going to be talking about today, this child of promise. And there's even more building of faith as they go, but God had to get him to a certain point. And so as they're on this journey, part of the reason that God takes so long for this to happen is because it had to be well known that this wasn't just a fluke, that it wasn't an accident, that this is a miracle of the Lord. And so sometimes there's a purpose in the waiting. Sometimes there is a reason for the delay that it feels like you have in the promise that God has spoken to you. And like I said, it's not just something that Abraham made up on his own or even just something that he asked for. Now, God will give us the desires of our heart when our heart is pointed toward him. But this is something that God had spoken himself to Abraham. He's going to be the father of many nations. And Sarah's going to be the mother of many nations. And then God comes in after all of this time and tells him a year from now, this is going to happen. But while they were walking on this journey, partway through, they decided to try to figure it out on their own. Sarah has this bright idea. Why don't you, since we haven't had the baby yet that God promised, maybe we're supposed to do this ourselves and not wait on the Lord. And so she has this bright idea that why don't you sleep with my servant and have a baby with my servant, and then maybe that's the child that God was talking about. And it wasn't the child that God had talked about. And then all of this strife comes in because there's jealousy on the part of Sarah. There's an arrogance on the part of the servant Hagar, where she begins to look down on Sarah because she was able to bring forth the child that Sarah wasn't able to have. And so there's all these really just wrong attitudes that are bringing in this strife. And we're going to see how that kind of plays out in the end. And so that's the advantage that we have of looking back on a story. I love how the Word of God doesn't bring you perfect people who do things perfectly and who never struggle and who never need God's grace and mercy. Like every single person, as you read through the Word of God, you see the need that they have for God's grace and mercy. We all need God's grace and mercy. We all fall short and we all need Jesus. And God had a plan to bring Jesus into the earth, and he used Abraham, who wasn't perfect, who had to learn some lessons along the way, as you're building your faith, you're growing in your relationship with God. We see that happening with Abraham. He trusted God enough to step out and go where God told him to go. But partway through, when he hadn't received what he had been promised, They tried to go their own way with it. And we'll read and we'll talk about that more as we go. It says, so the Lord kept his word and did for Sarah exactly what he had promised. She became pregnant and she gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. This happened just at the time when God said it would. Abraham named his son Isaac. 8 days after Isaac was born, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. And so when you read this chapter and it says, she gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. That word old age, I was listening to a message earlier where they really break apart the Hebrew words in the scripture, and that old age word can mean maturity. It can mean wisdom. It also means old age. He was long in his years, but all those things come with the old age. You're hopefully wiser now than you were 10 years ago. Hopefully you are growing in your relationship with God. You're making better decisions than you were making before, trusting God more than you ever have at this point. And so we see that Abraham has come to this place of old age, wisdom, maturity, and God's going to do some really big things through him. It says, and then you see Abraham's obedience, that 8 days after the baby was born, he circumcised the baby just as God had commanded him to. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. And Sarah declared, God has brought me laughter. All who hear about this will laugh with me. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse a baby? Yet I have given Abraham a son in his old age. Just the overwhelming joy of that moment when God had promised you something and then you're sitting there with that promise in your hands. Like, this really just happened. And I've been in that place before, walked into that place before where God had spoken something to my heart and it came to pass. And then, I have things still out there that he has promised to me, spoken to me, and that I really believe he has for me. And the joy that will come when I sit with those things in my hand, and not even just the receiving in the moment of joy, but the knowing that God said it and I heard him. He spoke to me and cared enough about me to say a word to me. And, just the joy of that moment. And here is Abraham and Sarah with the desire of their heart sitting in their hands. And, there are many different ways that God is going to bring things to pass. This is the way he did this with Abraham and Sarah. And he's got a different path and a different journey for each of us. And we're building our faith as we go along the way. And, really, sometimes if we receive something sooner than we're supposed to receive it, it's not going to go well because we're not mature enough or ready enough, haven't been through some of the experiences that we need to go through to get us to the place where we're ready to receive what he has for us. You wouldn't give your 13-year-old the keys to your car because they're not ready yet. But you will give the keys to your car to your 16, 17-year-old because they've took time, they've prepared, they've grown, they've learned, they've matured. And so there's certain responsibility that comes with a certain level of maturity. And that holds true in your relationship with God. Sometimes God promises you something in your heart, but it's not for right now. It's for later on. And it's because he's got some work that he needs to do on the inside of you, some experiences that you need to walk through to get you to the place where you're ready to receive what it is that he has for you, where you're strong enough to hold that, where you're strong enough to carry what it is that he has for you. And so be patient in that waiting. And, if you mess it up along the way and you try to go your own way and try to make it happen for yourself, and you find yourself in that place where you really didn't do things the way God wanted you to do, know that there is grace and mercy for you. Know that when your heart is pointed in the direction of God, you don't have to just be counted out because you stepped out in the wrong direction or did something that you thought you were doing the right thing, but it really wasn't what God wanted you to do. And so just know God is bigger than our circumstances. He is bigger than our mistakes, and that our faith journey is a building of faith as we go. And our trust in God grows as we walk with Him and as we trust Him, as we step out on the water, as we believe that He is who He says He is. We don't worship the miracle. We worship the miracle maker. We worship the one who parts the water and who heals the blind and makes the lame walk. And we don't worship Him just because of those things. We worship Him because He loves us. He gave His life for us. Those things flow out of that relationship. And so here we are with Abraham and Sarah receiving that, just this moment of joy. In the way that life goes, there's the highs and then there come the lows. And life is like a roller coaster. And I felt like myself in the last few months, my life has been just an insane roller coaster of ups and downs and twists and turns. And, just knowing that no matter what life brings, that Jesus is with me. That Jesus died to take away my sins, that I am walking with God in the middle of all these moments. I pray that you come to a place in your relationship with God that no matter which way life happens to spin on you, that God is with you and that He loves you and that He cares about you, that He has good plans for your life. And that when you know that God has spoken something to your heart, that you can be patient in the waiting until you get there. And so, like I said, just like the highs and lows and ups and downs, they have received this beautiful blessing, incredible miracle, miraculous moment with God. And then comes the drama. It says Hagar and Ishmael are sent away. When Isaac grew up, he was about to be weaned. Abraham prepared a huge feast to celebrate the occasion. But Sarah saw Ishmael, the son of Abraham, and her Egyptian servant Hagar making fun of her son Isaac. So she turned to Abraham and she demanded, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son. He is not going to share the inheritance with my son Isaac. I won't have it." And so it is that we find Abraham and Sarah made the decision to bring Hagar into the middle of their relationship and of their marriage. Hagar before didn't ask to be put in this situation. And when she was put into the middle of it, she responded by condescending, looking down on, being high and lofty and proud, and looking down on Sarah because she wasn't able to have a child. And Hagar had Ishmael, and so she began to treat Sarah with this attitude, just this ugly attitude. And again, Hagar didn't ask to be put into that situation, so you can almost understand the reason behind her having the attitude that she had. But to tell the truth, it doesn't matter what situation you're in, whether you place yourself in that situation like Sarah had, or whether you were placed in a situation that you never asked to be put into like Hagar had. Our heart, our attitude, they matter. And whether it's your own doing or someone else's doing, your heart turned toward God, your attitude can take you to incredible places, or they can take you to a place that you never want to be in. And so it can get you kicked out of places. Your attitude can get you kicked out of places. You can love God and have a wrong attitude, and your wrong attitude can walk you right out of a blessing. And so we're going to see kind of how that happened here. And it says, this upset Abraham very much because Ishmael was his son. But then God himself speaks to Abraham and says, but God told Abraham, don't be upset over the boy or your servant. Do whatever Sarah tells you, for Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted. But I will also make a nation of the descendants of Hagar's son, because he is your son too. And so there has been a lot that has come from this decision that Sarah and Abraham have made. They have brought someone into their marriage that should never have been invited in. And when they did this, there are consequences that come. God still shows grace and mercy in the middle of those consequences, because this is Abraham's son too, but he's not the one that God had promised to him. And so we'll see how this walks out. It says, but God told, okay, I already read that part. It says, so Abraham got up early the next morning and prepared food and a container of water, and he strapped them on Hagar's shoulders. Then he sent her away with their son, and they wandered aimlessly in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water was gone, she put the boy in the shade of the bush, and she went and sat down by herself 100 yards away. I don't want to watch the boy die, she said, and she burst into tears. But God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said, Hagar, what is wrong? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Go to him and comfort him, and I will make a great nation from his descendants. And then God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well full of water, and she quickly filled her water container and gave it to the boy to drink. God was with the boy as he grew up in the wilderness and became a skillful archer. He settled in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother arranged for him to marry a woman from the land of Egypt. And so we see God's grace and mercy. We see God helping in the middle of a situation. Like I said, Hagar had never asked to be put into the middle of, but then when she was there, her attitude got her taken out of the middle of that situation. But God was still with them. But God still didn't transfer that blessing over of the promise that he had made, because Ishmael was not the one that God had promised to Abraham and Sarah. And, so we remember this is Old Testament. This is before Jesus. But there was a plan that God had set in place to get Jesus into the earth. And he needed things to go according to his plan. But he shows grace and mercy in the middle of Abraham and Sarah really just kind of messing that up. And so that's where we leave off with that story. And it says Abraham's covenant with Abimelech. So about this time, Abimelech came with Phicol, his army commander, to visit Abraham. God is obviously with you and helping you in everything you do, Abimelech said. Swear to me in God's name that you will never deceive me, my children, or any of my descendants. I have been loyal to you, so now swear that you will be loyal to me and to this country where you are living as a foreigner. So Abraham and Sarah had come into Abimelech's country, and Sarah told them that she was Abraham's sister, just like Abraham had asked her to. And the Lord himself speaks to Abimelech and says, hey, this is not his sister, it's his wife. And all this bad stuff is fixing to happen to you if you don't give her back. And so it was that he did give her back. He listened to the Lord, and there was blessing that came from that when he listened to the Lord. He said, Abraham replied, yes, I swear it. And then Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well that Abimelech's servants had taken by force from Abraham's servants. So there is this relationship that has been formed, even through Abraham not doing things, in faith and trust with the Lord. But God is still using this relationship, and he's growing this relationship between Abraham and Abimelech. And the thing that really caught my eye as I was reading that was that Abimelech saw the relationship that he had with God. And even though Abimelech is the one in authority, he's asking for Abraham's favor because he sees that God is with him, and that spirit of God that is moving on the inside of him. And it says, Abraham replied, "Yes, I swear it." And that spirit that's on the inside of him, it gives him favor. And then Abraham complained to Abimelech about the well that the servants had taken by force. "This is the first I've heard of it," Abimelech answered. "I have no idea who is responsible. You never came and complained about it before." And so then Abraham gave him some sheep and some goats and some cattle, and they made a treaty. But Abraham also took 7 female lambs and set them off by themselves. Abimelech asked, "Why have you set these 7 apart from the others?" And Abraham replied, "Please accept these 7 lambs to show your agreement that I dug this well." And then he named the place Beersheba, which is called the Well of the Oath, and because it is where they had sworn the oath. After making their covenant at Beersheba, Abimelech left with Phicol, the commander of his army, and then they returned home to the land of the Philistines. Then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he worshipped the Lord, the eternal God. And Abraham lived as a foreigner in Philistine country for a long time. So even when he wasn't in the place where that belonged to him, even when he was off in another land, the favor of God just shone all around him. The fact that God was with him, and God used him and gave him favor with kings, and gave him position, and gave him open doors because he was with God. And so that's what I kind of want to leave you guys with today. Your attitude, your heart toward God, it can either walk you into blessing or it can walk you out of it. And even in the middle of your faith walk with God, a mistake doesn't count you out. There's a difference between being unqualified. God will call the unqualified, and he qualifies them as they go, and disqualified, which is a place that your attitude can take you to. Your focus being in the wrong place, not on God, not in worship to the Lord, but in just a direct, scoffing, disobedient. It's like the difference between Peter and the difference between Judas. Peter loved the Lord. Peter denied Jesus 3 times out of fear, out of this disconnect, because Jesus had been with him and then he was away from him and the Holy Spirit hadn't come yet. But then Judas directly, maliciously, in greed and arrogance, turned Jesus over to be crucified. There's a difference between growing and learning and not being there yet. The process of sanctification, it's a process over time, and being just directly disobedient to the Lord and not caring what God thinks about things, and just really this attitude of disobedience, of pridefulness that is not a heart directed toward God. So where's your heart position today? Are you in a place where you are growing those faith muscles, where you are learning each step of the way, maybe learning as you fall down, getting back up? Or are you turned in a complete wrong direction, fighting against God, fighting against the blessing that he's trying to pour out on you? Where's your heart today? So that's what I want to leave you guys with. Genesis chapter 21. That was a whole lot of stuff. And I will catch you back again in Genesis chapter 22.